I'm Beth Mueller.
And I'm Rob Mueller.
And we're going to be making bread today. And both of us work in churches. And if you're a churchy kind of person, then you probably know that coming up this week, because we're in the middle of Holy Week, is Maundy Thursday. And so we thought it might be cool, since a lot of us are going to be celebrating communion as a community, but at home, that it might be cool to show you a really easy way to make bread for your family's communion service. And if you're not a churchy person, it's just a frankly delicious loaf of bread.
Yeah.
So,
especially in the morning, sliced with butter and honey on it.
Yeah, very delicious. So this bread recipe is, it's easier than a lot of recipes. You don't have to know a lot about making bread. And it's one that my mom used to make really all my childhood. She would make bread almost every single day. So we would wake up in the morning and have a piece of delicious, warm from the oven, homemade whole wheat bread for our breakfast. It was really great. So this is Nani's whole wheat bread recipe. And all you need is a bowl and a wooden spoon, which I didn't grab. A bowl and a wooden spoon. You don't need any special equipment. You don't need a bread maker. You don't need anything else. So I'm going to attach the recipe to this, but I'm going to talk you through it too. So the first thing that we're going to do is we have to warm some milk. So I've got a saucepan here, 2 cups of milk, and then we're going to do a 1/4 cup of molasses and a 1/4 cup of honey. And basically, I'm going to add this to the milk because it distributes it really nicely when it's warm. Go ahead and dump that in. And the molasses and the honey give it a really delightful flavor. It's a real sort of hearty, warm sort of flavor to the bread. Go. And then when you warm milk for bread, you want to get it warm, but you don't want it to boil. If it's too hot, it's going to kill your yeast. So just heat it until, and I use my finger. I just stick my finger in it, stir it around, stick my finger in it, and when it feels nice and warm to the touch, not cool, not lukewarm, but pretty warm, then it's ready. Okay, so while the milk is warming, I've got a cup of water here, and this is also very warm water. I get it as hot out of the tap as possible. And I'm going to pour it into my mixing bowl. There's nothing else in here in my mixing bowl. It's empty right now. And if you use like a pottery bowl, make sure it's not super cold. You want your bowl to be warm enough that it activates the yeast. Okay, I've got 3 tablespoons of yeast, and I'm going to add that to my water and just let that soften up. And all I'm doing is just sort of mixing it around so the yeast gets nice and wet. And then you just want to set that aside and let it sit for a second. So the only other ingredients that I've got in this recipe are flour, salt, oil, our milk mixture, and our water with yeast. It's a really simple recipe. And I've already pre-measured everything out, but basically you've got a half a cup of canola oil, 2 teaspoons of salt, and 7 cups of flour. This recipe is one of the few bread recipes that I really prefer to be whole wheat. And so I've used 3 cups of white flour and 4 cups of whole wheat flour. But you can use sort of any combination that you want. But the whole wheat works really well with the honey and the molasses and gives it a really nice flavor. Okay, so let's check on our milk. It's gonna need another minute here. So we're gonna take a pause and come back when the milk is hot. Okay, so I think our milk is just about right, and you can see it turns this beautiful brown color with the molasses and the honey. I stick my finger in there. It's not too hard, it's not too hot for my skin, and so it's just about right. So I'm gonna go ahead and add to my yeast mixture the oil and my milk And then basically I'm ready to add my dry ingredients, and I'm just going to mix it by hand. So I'm adding all of my flour, and I'm adding my salt, and then I'm just going to mix it by hand. And when you mix bread, you want to just be gentle in your motions. You don't want to beat it. You don't want to smash it. So I'm just sort of folding it, and it makes a really nice wet dough. And so, there, can you see that? It makes a nice wet dough, and you're not gonna knead it at this point. You're gonna let it rise. So really you just wanna get things nice and mixed up. It has a lot of there's a lot of yeast in this recipe. This recipe makes one really large loaf, or you can make it into 2 smaller loaves. And I realized, because I gave my daughters this recipe, and neither one of them have loaf pans. So I'm going to show you in just a minute what to do if you don't have a loaf pan. Okay, so I've got this just about right. And you can see it's sort of forming a nice ball in the middle there. And I'm just going to get everything off my wooden spoon. And then I'm going to let this rise. And you can see I picked a bowl that's quite a bit bigger than my dough. And I did that on purpose because you're going to need space for the dough to rise. So I'm just going to put plastic wrap over the top of this. The other thing that you can do is you can get a dish towel, and you can get it wet with warm water and just lay that over the top. And you don't need to, it doesn't need to be super tight, doesn't need to fit super well. You just want to keep the moisture and the heat in the bowl so that your bread can rise. All right, so I'm going to do one that way, and then we're going to just set it aside and let it rise. Okay, so these are the loaf pans that I'm going to use, and I'm using 2 because the loaf pans that I have are kind of small. So I'm going to use 2 loaf pans, but if you don't have a loaf pan, you can use like a 9x12 pan, and all you need to do is take some aluminum foil, and you're going to make a divider down the middle. And you can do this any way that works. It really, there's no big science to it. I'm just going to fold it a few times till it's nice and thick. Okay, and then I'm just going to lay these 2 pieces out so that the bread is going to sit, the bread dough is going to sit on top of it so that it won't move the divider. So you see what I've done here? It's really very simple. And I'm just going to set it in here, and you can see that gives you 2 loaf pans. So I'm going to prepare my pans just with some cooking spray. You can flour the bottoms if you want to. To be honest, I don't usually, and my bread comes out just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and pan these pans, and then I'm just going to leave them aside while I let my bread rise. Now usually it takes about 30 minutes for your bread to rise the first time. So we're going to take a break, and then I'll tell you exactly how long I waited for my bread to rise, but you want it to double in size. Okay, so see you in a minute. Okay, we're back, and this actually rose in about 15 or 17 minutes. So as you can see, it's puffed up quite nicely, and it looks really delicious and warm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it out on a floured board, and if you don't have a baking table like this, just use a cutting board, or you can even use a countertop. You just want to spread some flour around, and I use white flour for this, not whole wheat. And then basically you just kind of smush the dough back down. That's called punching the dough. And I'm going to dump it out onto my floured board. Now, I'm going to knead it just a little bit because it helps give the bread some nice texture and some nice body. But you don't have to worry too much about this step or what you do with how you knead it. You just basically want to kind of work the dough a little bit. Now, since I'm making it in 2 loaves, I'm just going to cut the bread in half. And I'm going to take each half, and this is a bread making trick. I'm going to take each half, flatten it out just a little bit, and then I just sort of roll it. It helps give you a really nice texture on the bread, and it helps give you kind of a lovely loaf shape. So I'm going to take one of my greased loaf pans, and I'm going to put it in there. I'm going to do the same thing with this guy. Just going to roll it. You're not working in a bunch more flour or anything like that. You're just doing that so that the bread has a nice even texture. Okay, so I'm going to put them in my loaf pans, and you can see they fill these loaf pans pretty well. Now, this next piece is important. You need to let the dough rise again. And I'm not going to cover it this time. When I made the bread the last time, we covered it and it stuck to the plastic and it made a mess. But you want to make sure that the tops of your loaves don't dry out. So I just spray the tops with some spray oil, and it keeps them from drying out, keeps them nice and moist. And the dough is still quite warm, so I'm anticipating that it's not going to take long for them to rise again. And I want them to rise until they're starting to really pop up out of those pans. If you do something like this, these are a little bit bigger than my loaf pans, and so your loaves are going to be a little bit smaller. But really what you want is for the dough to really lift, the dough to grow, you to see that sort of air filling it up as it rises with the reaction with the yeast. All right, so we're gonna leave these guys, and I'm gonna put them, I've already started my oven, so I'm gonna put them just on top of my oven, because that's an extra warm place for them to rise, and I'm just gonna leave them there. And since the dough rose in about 15 minutes last time, I'm gonna check them again in 15 minutes and see what they look like. See you in 15.
Here are the loaves, partially risen. You can see how they're beginning to rise above the top, but it is not going to be long before they're ready to go.
Okay, so it's been another 15 minutes, and these are looking great, and it's time to put them in the oven. Unlike a lot of yeast breads, these bake only at 350, so I've got something else in the oven. I'm just going to add the bread to it. As you can see, they're filling over the top, but they aren't overflowing. And I'm going to put these on the top rack. And these only cook for, 30-ish. Don't look at my dirty oven. That's terrible. Sorry. These only cook for about 30-ish minutes. So we'll check back in when they're all out of the oven. Okay, it's been about 30 minutes, and I think these guys are all ready. Oh, look at that. So pretty. Nice and golden brown. And what happens is, if you tap it, it has kind of a hollow feel. It doesn't feel, I don't know, it doesn't feel doughy. Do you like my hot pad? I'm not bossy, I'm the boss. All right, we're gonna take this guy over and we're gonna eat it. All right, that's some good looking bread.
It sure is. This is the part I get to come back for.
Oh, look at that.
That's beautiful.
Beautiful texture. Rob likes the crunchy on the end.
I do.
It's a really moist bread.
Yeah, I like butter. I won't deny it.
Once you've let it cool, just store it in a Ziploc bag. And if you don't eat it up in a day or two, which frankly I'll be really surprised, then stick it in the fridge. And the best way to heat it up is to cut off a big thick slice and melt some butter in a frying pan and then just fry it in the butter on both sides. So delicious. Really, really yummy.
Some honey?
I do want some honey.
All right.
So we started out by talking about this as maybe a loaf of bread that you can make as a family to celebrate communion if you're participating in a Maundy Thursday service. So Rob, why don't you talk a little bit about the Passover meal? And
So Maundy Thursday in our tradition is our...
that means I get to eat because he's talking.
It's our remembering of Jesus' last Passover celebration with his disciples. Now, Passover is also referred to as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Well, obviously, with 3 tablespoons of yeast in it, this is not unleavened bread. But the Passover is also a time when the Jewish people come home, come deep. They root themselves again in the depth of their own tradition. They root themselves in their deepest identity. And as we are having to come home, literally, in these stay-at-home times, we are rerouting ourselves in our own families and our own family traditions. And so while this may not be traditional Passover unleavened bread, it sure does feel like home to me. And I hope it feels like home to you when you celebrate it as well. So here's to our celebrations and to your loaves of bread. Enjoy.
And whether you eat it for Maundy Thursday or whether you eat it for breakfast, enjoy the bread and enjoy the time together. It really is a precious moment out of normal time. So I hope you can try to enjoy it.
And now it's time to kiss the cook.